Hi, listeners. We want to tell you about a podcast we're really digging. It's called Christopher Kimball's Milk Street Radio. Every week, they travel the world to find the most fascinating stories about food, including children who harvest cod tongues after school in Norway and a detective who tracks down food thieves. And on Milk Street Radio, you can always find the unexpected. The comedian who ranks apples using an elaborate 100-point system, the secret history of grocery stores, and how to eat your way through Italy. They also interview the most beloved names in food like Jacques Pepin, Sola Aweli, Jose Andres, Jet Tila, Ina Garten, Nigella Lawson, and Padma Lakshmi. Plus, co-hosts Christopher Kimball and Sarah Moulton do live calls with listeners and answer their questions about ingredients, techniques, and culinary mysteries. Like, why roasting a leg of lamb made one caller's oven explode? Ever wonder why your bread won't rise or your souffle falls flat? Chris and Sarah have the answers. You'll also hear from a rotating cast of contributors, including Kenji Lopez-Alt, Cheryl Day, Dan Pashman from The Sporkful, and Alex Ainuz, a French guy cooking from YouTube. Take a listen at 177milkstreet.com/radio or just search your podcast app for Milk Street Radio. You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org. Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways. Hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pit masters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey. Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor with your host, Zella Palmer. This is a special episode. This episode of Culture and Flavor is personal. On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, the definitive biography by Alelia Bundles, came out in 2001. I was still very young and couldn't fully understand the magnitude of what this book would mean to me and my family. I can remember the day that my mother bought a copy of On Her Own Ground and how she cried tears of joy to see a story about Madam C.J. Walker that was also connected to her grandfather, the Dr. Joseph Henry Ward. I can remember stories that my grandmother, Mary Rowena Ward, told me from her rocking chair about growing up on Tuskegee's campus, sitting on George Washington Carver's lap, and the deep pain and longing for her parents. My grandmother's father, Dr. Joseph Henry Ward, served in World War I as a Black surgeon in the Colored Regiment of the U.S. Army. He was born and raised in Wilson, North Carolina, where he left as a teenager to land in Indianapolis, Indiana, where he would eventually graduate from Short Ridge High School and graduate from medical school to become one of the top Black doctors and surgeons in the United States. He was appointed by President Warren G. Harding and Tuskegee University President Robert Russell Moton with the help of W.E.B. Du Bois to be the first African-American hospital administrator for the U.S. Veterans Hospital in Tuskegee, Alabama, during segregation to help Black World War I veterans returning home. Recently, he was awarded the Exceptional Service Award, one of the highest awards by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Dennis McDonough, at Tuskegee University and Veterans Hospital. I was invited to speak for their Black History Month and to celebrate the naming of Dr. Joseph Henry Ward's food pantry. I was so touched by this monumental event, imagining what my ancestors must have felt like to be awarded such a prestigious award 100 years later. But how Madam C.J. Walker and Dr. Ward, my great-grandfather, are connected is why we are going to interview and talk to Alelia Bundles. Madam C.J. Walker lived in my great-grandparents' home and operated her business in the early years of her moving to Indianapolis. Advertisements in the local newspaper included my great-grandfather, Dr. Joseph Henry Ward Sanitarium, as a place where they could buy hair products and receive services from Madam C.J. Walker. My great-grandmother, Zella Locklear Ward, who I am named after, and Madam C.J. Walker became dear friends. And on her own ground, I remember crying and realizing the legacy of my family and the legacy of Madam C.J. Walker when I read about Zella and Joseph coming to Madam C.J. Walker's bedside in her home in New York on her deathbed and realizing how traumatic that must have been for them after they recently lost their only son to Spanish influenza after Dr. Ward returned from World War I. This episode of Culture and Flavor is very special. It is about legacy. It is about Black generational wealth. It is about the unknown heroes' stories that have yet to be told. As B. Mike, a New Orleans artist, says, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. And I say, we are here to finish what they started. A'Lelia Bundles is the author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, a New York Times notable book about her entrepreneurial great-great-grandmother and the nonfiction inspiration for Self-Made, the fictional Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer. Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker, and the Harlem Renaissance will be the first major biography of her great-grandmother, which will be published in 2025 by Scribner. You all might remember her as she was featured in the second season of High on the Hog, where she talked about her legacy as being the great-great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker. I'm so excited to have her on this episode of Culture and Flavor as we talk about our mutual family legacies. Welcome.
Zella, I'm delighted to be with you.
I'm so excited to have you on my podcast. I have to tell you, I've just admired you from afar for so long. And my mother, was so honored. And she literally had on her own ground, your biography that's now called Self-Made, by her bedside, and was so proud to see her grandfather in the biography and to tell that story. So I thank you so much personally from my family for including Dr. Joseph Ward in your book.
Well, the Wards were definitely a key part of Madam Walker's sort of early welcome to Indianapolis that gave her some credibility with the community. So they were really close friends. There was a real friendship there.
Absolutely. And, I can just remember stories that my grandmother would tell me just about how she remembered Madam Walker and how, pivotal it was to be in that time in Black Indianapolis. I know we talk a lot about Black Chicago, about Harlem, but there isn't as much attention on Indianapolis. And I know you were pivotal in helping restore and the preservation of Indiana Avenue and all of these stories. But Indianapolis was very pivotal in the civil rights movement, the early part of the civil rights movement. It was a bustling economy for African-American entrepreneurs. And I would love for you to talk about Black Indianapolis. I would love for you to talk about anything that I don't even know about my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother that would help me on this journey to continue to uplift their stories.
Well, I guess first I just want to say that I love that we're both named after the ancestors, you with Zella and me with A'Lelia. So and it's not a heavy burden. It's an opportunity. It's a privilege to be able to reference these ancestors, these amazing people. So I'm glad that we share that. And I was just in Indianapolis a couple of weeks ago. There's a new exhibit at the Indiana Historical Society, really on the history of the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana. And the title of the exhibit is Resist. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Ward is among the people who were part of the Black community who were resisting the Ku Klux Klan. So I hope you'll get a chance to see that. But, when Madam Walker moved to Indianapolis, she had been she was a longtime member of the Court of Calamity, the organization of women, the Women's Auxiliary of the Knights of Pythias, the Black Knights of Pythias. Even when she was a poor washerwoman in St. Louis at St. Paul AME Church, she joined together with some of the club women, the choir members, the missionary society people, and they could see a spark in her. So she was part of their organization. And that membership in the court of Calanthe really gave her entree to women who were involved in a national club movement. One of her real mentors, Jessie Batts Robinson, was a national officer. And I feel sure that that is how she became connected to Dr. Ward, so that when she was moving from Pittsburgh to Indianapolis in 1910, that was the family with whom she stayed. And as you mentioned, she set up her business in the Ward Sanitarium. So that connection of Black folks in these benevolent societies moving from town to town, developing relationships, that was really critical in helping her to become established in Indianapolis. She chose Indianapolis because it really did have a very thriving Black business community, even though people were, when I say I grew up in Indianapolis, they're like, are there Black folks there? And it's like, yes, there actually really are quite a few of us, and we have been there for quite a long time. But it wasn't as big a city as Chicago. But Indianapolis, it was 10% of the population in Indianapolis when she moved there in 1910 was Black. And there was a specific neighborhood along Indiana Avenue, and Dr. Ward's sanitarium was in that neighborhood. So she was really right in the center of the activity in Black Indianapolis. So there were 3 Black newspapers, including a nationally distributed newspaper called the Indianapolis Freeman, and it was also a great transportation hub. It was called the Crossroads of America because literally hundreds of trains, freight trains and passenger trains, went through the city every day. So for somebody who had a mail order business, it was an excellent location.
Mm. When I think about Indianapolis, I think about my mother, and I am actually going to go to the Resist exhibit in a couple of weeks. I wasn't able to make the grand opening, but I am going there. And I think Dr. Leon Bates, who was instrumental in putting a historic landmark on on the property where the sanitarium, Dr. Ward's sanitarium was. And I want to talk about just the people that were in Black Indianapolis during that time when Madam C.J. Walker was there. We have, Charles Ransom. We have so many different people that weren't able to, I don't think were able to have, you have a short amount of time when you direct or people write screenplays or do adapted screenplays from biographies. And there was a short amount of time that you have in a series. But I would love for you to talk about just those pivotal and instrumental African Americans in Black Indianapolis in the end of the 19th century that really, I think, get under noticed.
There's a well-known photograph that includes Madam Walker with Booker T. Washington at the dedication of the Senate Avenue YMCA in 1913. And Dr. Ward is one of the people who's in that photograph, along with a couple of other Black Indianapolis businessmen, as well as Freeman B. Ransom, Madam Walker's attorney and general manager, and George Knox, who was the publisher of the Indianapolis Freeman. That they are the leadership of the Senate Avenue YMCA. But Dr. Ward was very much a part of that. There was an interesting sort of confluence of people coming together, both with a spirit of business, but someone, for instance, like George Knox, who had been enslaved, had come to Indiana and was a barber and had the barber shop in the premier hotel in Indianapolis that was very near the state house. So his clients were the leadership of the political parties. And of course, at that point, the Republican Party. So he was very active in Republican politics and then became the publisher of the newspaper. But to see that set of people in that photograph in 1913, that really shows you the leadership of Indianapolis. Then to have Madam C.J. Walker as a woman who was an entrepreneur joining that all-male group of leaders shows, I think, some progressiveness on the part of those men that they embraced her and they included her. And she, of course, was making a lot of money and able to contribute to some of their causes. But the city was an interesting in this sense that the schools were integrated in Indianapolis through the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that was quite unusual among many cities. St. Louis, the schools were segregated, but in Indianapolis, they were integrated. And then after Birth of a Nation and this sort of rise of this backlash against African Americans, the Ku Klux Klan took hold in Indiana. And it was really a lot of the leadership, the white leadership in Indianapolis, the sort of everyday businessmen who would not want to think of themselves as bad people, but it was what everybody else was doing. And that really created a lot of negative feelings towards African Americans. So that Crispus Attucks High School was built, and it was a segregated school. So now all the Black kids from all over the city had to go to Crispus Attucks. It opened in 1927. And around that same time, the F.B. Ransom, Madam Walker died in 1919. F.B. Ransom was the general manager of the company, and Madam Walker had wanted a building, a larger factory. And so he oversaw the construction of what is now the Madam Walker Legacy Center, a block-long Flatiron building with the factory, then the corporate offices, a theater, a drugstore, a beauty salon, NAACP offices, medical offices. So that what had been racially integrated, though not necessarily entirely welcoming to Black folks, became a city where many of the public facilities were segregated by custom.
For my listeners, if you ever get a chance to go to Indianapolis, the Madam C.J. Walker building is still there. It is a beautiful piece of architecture. I have gone there for my entire life, practically. You know, my mother, rest her soul, Alice Palmer, former senator. She was instrumental in making sure that we always went to Indianapolis, that even Indiana University did an architecture and anthrop project. And I remember my grandmother, when she was alive, receiving an award where they were unearthing some of the artifacts from the ground where these, what, Alelia is talking about, Ransom, George Knox, all of these, Dr. Ward, all of these pivotal historical figures in the development of Black Indianapolis. And I love to hear you talk about Crispus Attucks, because did you go to Crispus Attucks or did you go to Shortridge? I'm just curious.
No. My dad went to Crispus Attucks, but I went to North Central High School. So, the migration in Indianapolis and the Black neighborhood, Black folks lived sort of in all segments of the city. That Indiana Avenue corridor was the historically Black area. But over time, African Americans began moving farther north. And the neighborhood that I grew up in was a newly constructed suburban neighborhood, two sort of Black neighborhoods together, that houses were built in the late 50s, early 1960s. And so our school was North Central High School.
Okay. Yeah. My mother graduated from Shortridge High School, and she was one of the first classes to integrate the school. And I just remember her many stories. I was listening to a previous podcast that you were interviewed for, and I was thinking about my own family. You were talking about just how, you would go in the attic and, you would look through things and find the material culture that's left from your family. And, so much in my family was in that sanitarium. And I remember my mother telling me the story about how, she was going to school and the teacher told her, "Oh, Alice, you don't have to worry. Black people don't have history. You don't have to be a part of this history project." And, she went home in tears, and there was Zella. And here she was, in the attic and pulling out all of the, are things that we don't have anymore. And many of the documents that we don't have, how they came from North Carolina, the indigenous side, the Black folks side, all of that, and in this one box. And at that moment, it's been my family's legacy to continue to tell these stories, from my grandmother's rocking chair to my mother's rocking chair. And so to have your book and to, be able to tell the many stories of all of these historical figures that once existed in Black Indianapolis, and, and then evolving to Harlem, and New York, and the work that she did and with your great-great-grandmother, as well. It's so pivotal, I think, in telling Black stories, because a lot of our stories go to the grave, and your research has you were talked about in previous interviews about the access to research was very challenging for you. Can you talk a little bit about that and just about your book that's coming out in 2025 about A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance?
Well, yes, but first of all, I just have to tell you, my heart breaks when I hear stories like that with the teacher telling your mother that Black people have no history.
Mm,
And we are at a moment now when, for those of us who are not paying close attention, there are people who will continue to be able to say that. And it's why I'm, just obsessed with making sure that this fight against banned books and the trying to whitewash and sugarcoat our history, that we challenge it at every juncture. I heard Kimberly Crenshaw interviewed at the Ford Foundation yesterday by Darren Walker, and she was just talking about this pushback, this attack from legislatures, from school systems, from school boards, from Moms for Liberty, who are trying to make sure that our stories aren't told, so that we'd have
mhm,
another generation of young people who do not understand our history. And it really does start with our families. As you say, I'm really lucky that we do have lots of records. And part of it, I think, was Madam Walker's genius in picking the people who were part of her C-suite, her executive team. So F.B. Ransom, as the attorney, was very meticulous about keeping records, about doing annual reports. Her secretary, Violet Davis Reynolds, who started working for her in 1914, so certainly knew the wards. She was still working for the company in the 1970s. She lived not too far from
mhm,
me, and she would drive her little Thunderbird past my house going 25 miles an hour every day. But Violet
mhm.
Davis Reynolds saved the documents so that when the Walker Building was being converted into a cultural center, all of those records were preserved. And so now they are at the Indiana Historical Society, literally 40,000 documents, photographs, business
Mm,
records, personal letters. And then members of my family saved records, clothing, furniture, just all kinds of things that really allowed me to tell the story. And then in gathering the information, when I really started gathering this information when I was a graduate student at Columbia in journalism in the
mhm,
mid 1970s. And so I used that foundation of those documents and then enhanced it with newspaper records. And at that point, it was microfilm. I would have to go to libraries in different cities to read microfilm. Now you can read it on newspapers.com. And then manuscript collections in universities and institutions really all over the United States. So I have too much information where I know many people don't have enough information. But I do encourage folks to make sure you don't, when somebody dies, do not just go throw stuff out.
right.
Go through every box, and there's a gem somewhere that was on a stack that somebody meant to save, and it got mixed up with other things. So I just think we owe it to our ancestors to preserve this material, to preserve their story, and to give it forward to future generations. Now, so you're asking about the new book. I am so almost there. So
Well, let's back up. Let's back up for our
okay.
listeners who don't, who are still learning about who Madam C.J. Walker is. Madam C.J. Walker was born in Delta, Louisiana in 1867. I would love for you to talk about just who she is to our listeners, for those who don't know how important Madam C.J. Walker is to American history and to African American history, as well as women's history. She is so important to the development of entrepreneurship, education, and empowerment, women's empowerment.
Yeah, so as because I've been writing about this for so long, I'm so steeped in it. But I do realize that people may know, if they've heard Madam Walker's name, they may know a specific thing about her, and that many people don't really know who she is. And so the elevator version, Madam C.J. Walker was born Sarah Breedlove in 1867 on the same plantation where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. First child in her family born free. Orphaned at 7, married at 14, she said, to get a home of her own. Had one daughter, Lelia, and then her first husband, Moses McWilliams, died when she was 20. She moved up the river to St. Louis, where her brothers had really, you could say, migrated, but really fled the racial violence of the mid-1870s. And they had established themselves as barbers. Their barber shop was very near St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. And it was the women of the church who saw this poor, uneducated washerwoman and saw a spark in her, began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. She had a good enough voice to be in the choir, so she was modeling herself after these women who became her mentors. By the time she died in 1919, at age 51, she was living in a mansion in Irvington, New York, one of the wealthiest communities in the country, and she had created jobs for thousands of African-American women, become a patron of the arts, a philanthropist, and a major supporter of the NAACP's anti-lynching fund.
You know, one of the parts that I love about Madam C.J. Walker is that she was an educator. She really helped a lot of Black women. And we have to remember that during that time, a lot of only jobs that were available for Black women were being a washerwoman or a cook or a domestic, right?
And a sharecropper.
And a sharecropper, correct. And, you know, she was lifting up an entire generation to become entrepreneurs. And I'm sure, you know, many of the women that she probably worked with that were some of her agents or saleswomen. Some of them might have been illiterate. Some of them never had any opportunities like this. So she was also lifting up, you know, an entire generation of women to be self-sustainable. And I wanted to talk a little bit about just race, where there were race men and there were race women. And in that picture with Booker T. Washington and my great-grandfather, your great-great-grandmother, Madam C.J. Walker, and Ransom and Knox, all of that is such a historical picture in African-American history. I would love you to talk just about what it meant during that time to be a race man or a race woman.
You know, when you consider that when Madam Walker moved to Indianapolis in 1910, it was really less than 50 years after the start of the Civil War. So the emancipation that happened in 1863 for some and in 1865 for others, there's still people who were enslaved who are living. And so the culture very much feels that. And that first generation and second generation after emancipation were creating organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, the NAACP, the National Equal Rights League. Colleges and universities were being founded. Benevolent societies were blossoming. So people were creating their own institutions. And everybody didn't agree on exactly the way and the path forward, but they knew that they needed to create opportunities and sustenance for other African Americans, that people had to do it on their own. And I think Madam Walker, for me, really embodies what it meant to be a race woman. She is somebody who was born with nothing, who was aided and supported by other women especially, and who then used those opportunities she'd been given and used the gifts that she'd been given to turn around and give back to her community. She was sometimes, sometimes Mr. Ransom was worried that she was being too political when she was really speaking out on behalf of Black soldiers. And I'm sure somewhat inspired by the work that Dr. Ward was doing in France. She was really very tied to the plight of the Black soldiers and what was happening with them in France. And she was very outspoken about that and was criticized by some people in the Woodrow Wilson administration. But she really saw it as her duty to speak up. So much so that she and Ida B. Wells were spied upon by a a black spy in the War Department who listed them in a report as Negro subversives. Well, so for me, that was a badge of honor that she was speaking up enough that she was considered a threat, when in fact, what she was doing was trying to advocate for civil rights.
I can only imagine the conversations that was had between, all of at Madam C.J. Walker's dinner table at my great grandfather's house. I can only imagine, and the amount of, scholarship and just love for community and for pushing for the upliftment of African Americans, post World War One. It was such a pivotal time, I think, for, like you said, the upliftment of African American folks across the board. And there were major players as Madam C.J. Walker and Booker T. Washington, who was then the foremost Negro, as they would call it back then, Negro leader at the time. But they did have some challenges between Madam C.J. Walker and Booker T. Washington. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So one of the stories as I was doing this research, you pull a little piece from here, a little piece from there, and I came across a dissertation at Howard's Moreland Spingarn Library, a master's paper where the person had written about Madam Walker being at the 1912 National Negro Business League Convention. And in that dissertation, it mentioned a speech, a verbatim from this speech. And I was able to track down the speech because Booker T. Washington was very organized. He had everything transcribed at his conventions. So Madam Walker arrived at the convention. She'd actually gone to Tuskegee a year before, really kind of against Booker T. Washington's wishes, but she was so confident about telling her story that she went anyway. And he was somewhat not particularly welcoming, but she spoke anyway at Tuskegee. And then she made a contribution to the Senate Avenue YMCA, a $1,000 contribution. And so now, as she traveled, people really wanted to know the story of this washerwoman who had built a business where she could now give $1,000. So she decided she would go to Booker T. Washington's 1912 National Negro Business League Convention. She arrived at the convention on the first day, and she sent word that she wished to be included in the program, and he ignored her request. Second day, her good friend George Knox, the publisher of the Indianapolis Freeman, stands up and says, "We should hear from Madam C.J. Walker." Booker T. Washington ignored that request. And on the third and final day of the conference, when it was clear Booker T. Washington wasn't going to give Madam Walker the opportunity to speak, she stood up, looked at him, and said, "Surely you're not going to shut the door in my face. I'm a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. From there, I was promoted to the wash tub. From there, I was promoted to the kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations. And I have built my own factory on my own ground." The next year, he invited her back as a keynote speaker. And then we can see them in the 1913 photograph at the dedication of the YMCA in Indianapolis. She had sent her chauffeur to pick him up at the train station, and he was a guest in her home. So she turned that situation around. He was not used to women challenging him, even though his wife, Margaret Murray Washington, was quite a strong woman and a former president of the National Association of Colored Women. But Madam Walker was not part of his inner circle. And it took a while for her to push her way in. By the time he died in 1915, there was détente. But it's also important for me that Madam Walker was friendly with Booker T. Washington, with W.E.B. Du Bois, with A. Philip Randolph, with Monroe Trotter, with Ida B. Wells, with Mary McLeod Bethune, that the whole pantheon of Black political ideology, that she didn't feel beholden to any one person. She looked to see what other race men and women were doing for the good of the race.
And when you talk about, just she wasn't part of Booker T. Washington's circle, but clearly she was a part of Black Indianapolis circle. For Ransom to speak up for her to even, be part of this kind of network of community minded individuals who were pushing to not only build Black Indianapolis, but build Black generational wealth, Black education, and to uplift people who were still in segregation and still in many forms dealing with, as you talked about, the exhibit at Indiana Historical Society that's out now, Resist, dealing with the KKK and all kinds of issues. I want to talk about the Black church and specifically the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And my great grandfather, Joseph Ward, was a member of the church. And I assume that he was also a member and growing up in Wilson, North Carolina, when I spent a lot of time there researching him. And before my mother died, we were able to spend a lot of time in North Carolina and go to where he was born, to the house where he was born, to go to his father's house, to go to his great-great-grandmother's house. So it was a very pivotal moment in my own research of my family. And when I think about the stories that my grandmother told me about them attending AME church, and then Zella also befriending my great-grandmother, befriending Madam C.J. Walker, and them going to different churches in Kentucky and Indianapolis to introduce her to different, Black women organizations that could push her on the forefront to let them know this incredible woman who is doing something about hair loss, is doing something to give people jobs, is eventually going to build a building where even still, one of the last best friends of my mother, Charlene Bowles, her father was a dentist in that building and had a dentist office, right? And so she did so much. And I want to talk about the power of the Black church during that time. When you think about fast forward, how, it's not there, younger people are leaving the church. Other people they're having some challenges. But during that time period, the Black church was pivotal for Black activism.
Absolutely. And the AME Church is really, really important in Madam Walker's development. When she arrived in St. Louis around 1888, her brother's barbershop was very near the AME Church. And St. Paul AME at that point was the largest AME church west of the Mississippi. And they were powerful enough that they were able to build a new building. And it was a state-of-the-art organ, the Kilgan organ, which was the creme de la creme of organs. The choir director was a classically trained tenor who had performed opera, who was a principal of one of the Black schools. The leadership of the church were the sort of the key people in St. Louis. And I'm sure the Baptists had, similarly placed people. But this church was really full of leaders. And the history of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, for those who may not be familiar, is that even during slavery, when it was illegal for enslaved people to learn to read and write, the AME Church was educating people. There were AME churches that were stops on the Underground Railroad. So it was a very progressive and international outlooking church. So Madam Walker, still Sarah Breedlove, the poor washerwoman, really was fortunate to have been embraced by the women of the church. So every town that she moved to, she joined an AME church. It was St. Paul AME Church in St. Louis. When she moved to Denver, it was Shorter AME Church. When she moved to Pittsburgh, it was the AME Church. And one of the first things she did when she arrived in Indianapolis was to join Bethel AME Church. It was critical to her development. I love hearing that your great-grandmother traveled with her. I wish we had more details, and whatever I'd love to know more. But that was using that network of women in the churches and in these benevolent societies was really how Madam Walker modeled her organization of her sales agents.
Hmm. We will be back after a few messages from our advertisers for this special interview with Alilia Bundles. We thank you for joining Culture and Flavor, and we hope you tune in for the next half.
This episode is supported by HRN business member Gustiamo, the place to buy the best Italian food online. Gustiamo imports the most authentic food from Italian farmers and food makers dedicated to their food and traditions. Make Gustiamo your online store for ingredients and pantry staples from Italy. Visit GUSTIAMO.com. Gustiamo supports HRN's creative educational reporting and storytelling that drive conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place.
And we're back. So I wanted to talk about just your self-made, the Netflix, story of Madam C.J. Walker. How did it come about? It's such a pivotal moment and, just so important to have Black stories being told in this day and age in the 21st century that happened so many years ago, but have yet to be told. So can you talk about just the process of how you were able to get On Her Own Ground to become self-made and to become a Netflix film series?
Sure. So my book On Her Own Ground came out in 2001. And actually, if you see a book with self-made cover, that's just the movie tie-in title. The books for me will always be On Her Own Ground. And that, fortunately, it's still published in that way. But studios like to put their brand on book titles. So it is still On Her Own Ground. When that book, obviously with Madam Walker's story, it is a story like Ida B. Wells' story and some of these other amazing people whose stories need to be told. And Hollywood has not traditionally had a lot of interest in our stories. And then, so through the years, the book had been optioned various times, and then the option came back to me. And I would say a pivotal moment was the hashtag Oscars So White, and then women directors really complaining that they weren't getting opportunities. And so that sort of, perfect storm pushed forward, I don't know, 2016, 15, something like that. And I had finally, after a long time, calls from a number of different producers. And I elected to go with a particular producer because I believed that my book was important. That person believed my book was important. And I believed that I was going to have a lot of involvement in helping to shape the story. I was very excited when Octavia Spencer was attached to the series. And then things began to move forward with Netflix and Warner Brothers. And a writer was hired. And this is where the story takes a turn. Yeah, I had a conversation with the head writer who did not have a lot of credits to her name at that point. And our conversation was how she was seeing the story after she'd read my book and me making comments. And she said that she wanted to focus on the conflict between Madam Walker and her competitor, Annie Malone. And I said, well, I think that's an interesting element of the story. I personally would not make that the centerpiece of the story. And I think she was threatened by that I didn't agree with her. And so over the next year and a half, as the story was being developed, I was really sort of actively excluded from the conversations, even though my contract agreement said that I had script review. Finally, getting to the point where they're about to film, we sort of had to force me into the conversation, and they began to send the scripts to me. And I had basically set a bar, knowing that they were doing things that I might not agree with, because that's part of the Hollywood process, that you have to conflate things. But I'd set the bar to, please don't make me cringe. But when I read the first version of the script, in fact, they had leaned into a conflict between two women as opposed to an empowering story. I was kind of looking for hidden figures. I feel like they were leaning into Real Housewives of Atlanta. And conflict was two women catfighting over skin color, which was not part of the conflict. These women were both strong women. They benefited women. That was not the way that their lives really unfolded. And they literally had them calling each other the N word and the B word in this first version of the script. So that was a big concern for me. Ultimately, there were so many threads that I thought they didn't pull that I thought were much more important. And instead, there were things that were made up. The colorism line was made up. F.B. Ransom, Madam Walker's attorney, they created a made up character called Sweetness, who was not just a numbers runner, but a pimp. So I'm like, how many more stereotypes of Black men can we have? And then that F.B. Ransom bet on the numbers, and that's how help finance the company. That never happened. Alelia Walker did not have a girlfriend named Esther. And I just thought the role of women was really diminished. And even though I think Octavia Spencer was so great that she sort of helped save the day, because every time she came on camera, you got that sense of the majesty that she was putting into the character. But I just think it's almost at that point where when I was a little girl and we would get Jet every week, and you'd look in the back of back of Jet and you'd say, oh, Black people are on TV 8 times. And we were so excited to see ourselves that we just ran for the TV. And I think that we need to critique what Hollywood is doing. There are some directors, I love Ava DuVernay's new film, Origins. There are directors who really have a consciousness about our stories. And I think there are, unfortunately, people who lean into the cliches and kind of the cheap tricks. So I'm just, I'm very ambivalent about the series. I know that some people are entertained by it. And at the same time, as I'm finishing Joy Goddess, the book about Alelia Walker, I'm ready to have another bite at the apple. I'm not mad at Netflix. I just want different storytellers.
I am so glad that you said that, because, and it was one of the reasons why I reached out to you, kind of afterwards, because it does so much harm when these stories aren't told properly on screen to families. I think about just the ransoms, the generations, the descendants of the ransoms, all of these people who, gave their heart and soul to the upliftment of Black women, of Black men, and then to be portrayed as, something completely that is completely ahistorical and non-factual and isn't representative of the beautiful book that you wrote. So I appreciate us having this conversation, and that you giving honesty and transparency. And it's important to tell the truth about what happens in Hollywood, because so many times we tell our stories and we spend decades researching, and finally we get a book deal. And then some of us, very few of us, are able to go to the big screen. But then if we do go to the big screen, we don't have any inclusion in those rights. And when I think about even just this cookbook that I wrote, Ed Mitchell's Barbecue, that was the first cookbook out there that actually was able to tell a story of a barbecue pitmaster, Black pitmaster, raw and unapologetic. So we have to continue to push that. So thank you for sharing your honesty and integrity. Because of course, when my mother watched it when she was alive, and you have a very short amount of time, but she would have loved to see her grandfather, represented, and the relationship that they have. I'm sure, so many other people who have from Indianapolis who have roots there would have also loved for other, people who were pivotal into the community made version of Madam C.J. Walker to come to light as well. And all of those women, those agents who she helped. I mean, I would have loved to see that story. And you're absolutely right. It could have been done better. And it really could have been a powerful piece to encourage Black women to keep on pushing.
Well, that you're absolutely right. If I had, what I know now and what I will negotiate the next time around, if I have the opportunity, will be really different. But even that word that you said, community made, That is very important for me. Mutually made, community made versus self-made. I don't even really like the title because it doesn't represent what was going on. It was those women of the church when she was still a washerwoman. It was those members of the Court of Calanthe and the Knights of Pythias like Dr. Ward. It was that collaboration of people in the community who enabled her to become successful. Now, obviously, she did a lot of this because of her own genius and her own moxie, but you can't do it without the community. And she understood that. In 1917, when Madam Walker had her first convention of her sales agent, she said, I want you to understand that as Walker agents, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. And that for me embodies what that community in Indianapolis was doing. Absolutely, Dr. Ward should have been a character. He was, in the film, he was the person who welcomed her when she came to Indianapolis. He was with her when she died. I mean, that's a very amazing arc from that point to the end point. To look at the women who were part of lifting her up, mentoring her, and then who she empowered. And instead, in the series, that it had women like Booker T. Washington's wife saying, "Oh, well, we were so happy to be in the kitchen, and thank you for bringing us out." Well, that's just like the opposite. It's for women who, many of whom had gone to Oberlin, had studied in Europe, had traveled internationally. They were, that it just really misrepresented what that generation was about. But I think that, they're the showrunners and the head writer, who were all Black women, just really, for whatever reason, were leaning into just, I guess, an easily told story that they thought would resonate.
When I listened to, I heard you say in a previous interview that I think it was your mom who showed you some of the relics from your family,
Right.
And how you saw opera glasses. I still have Zella's opera coat.
Love it.
And, it was given to me, and I still have her china, and I just, in my mind, I imagine what it was like to serve all of these guests. And, and did she go to the opera with Adam C.J. Walker? And what you said about them traveling back and forth to Europe, they were, we have a log of, Dr. Ward and Zella going to France after his son died of Spanish influenza, and him actually taking her to see, what France looked like, and where he was on the front lines. And so I want to talk about just preservation and what it means to preserve these relics. Because sometimes, things happen in families, people move, sometimes things are stolen, How do we make sure that we preserve this material culture so that next generations and those like Alelia Bunders or those like Zella Palmer can go and say, you know what, I'm going to tell these stories. I'm going to get in those archives, and I'm going to tell this story because this is what I'm supposed to do.
Yes. This is, dear to my heart to talk about this. I think the first thing is to write down everything that to interview whatever living relatives you have, because they're going to give you the clues on the things that are important. So that's really important. And it's something we take for granted, but these days, grandchildren can take out their phones and do interviews. And so we need to create that body of the oral history. There are places, things like the history makers that has the all of these wonderful oral histories. And so that's key, take the oral history. The next part is in your house, whatever records you have, make sure that they are well organized. And if you do have the love letters between great grandparents, if you have the birth certificates, if you have the photographs, make sure that you are putting them in what are called Hollinger boxes. You can Google Hollinger box. Those are boxes that are acid free, and that means that your documents will be preserved. Label them, organize them. If you have photographs, and even if they're the photographs on your phone, download them to a flash drive. Anything that's historic, make sure that you are scanning it, and then take those photos and put them in a place that is fireproof. And then the next step is to, when if you have those kinds of records, to consider where you might want to donate those. And it can be the local historical society that welcomes papers and photographs from people of color, from African American families. It might be Moreland Spin Garden at Howard. It might be the Schomburg Collection in New York. It might be the National Museum of African American History. But these museums and these university collections and these historical societies are the places that are the depository for our family history. And I know that as I was doing the research very early on, I went to the St. Louis Historical Society, the Missouri Historical Society, Chicago, Schomburg, all over the country. And it is basically being able to read these through these scrapbooks and these letters and other documents that people preserved literally for the last 200 years that allow me to tell the story, to have the little tidbit, the little gem that turns up in the book. And it might have taken me 2 days to research it, and it might end up as a sentence, but it's those things that give authenticity to our stories.
And I want to talk about High on the Hog. You were featured on High on the Hog second season.
That was so much fun.
I'm sure it was. And I would love for you to talk about just food and Madam C.J. Walker. I mean, talk about some of the fabulous dinners that she had and, just in her, life. I mean, she had such an incredible life. She, wherever she went, from St. Louis, to Indianapolis, to New York, and then her daughter, Alelia Walker, was such a historical figure in Harlem, in the Harlem Renaissance. I would love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, I loved High on the Hog. What an incredible series that is, and what fabulous storytelling. And, I worked as a producer, as you know, for 30 years with NBC and ABC. So I'm a real, visual person, and I really pay attention to camera angles and shot composition. And so it was just a joy to watch every episode, and really an honor to be included in the Harlem, New York episode of the second season of High on the Hog. And when I got the call and there was some interest in featuring Madam Walker's story and featuring Villa Lawaro, I said, but we have to tell Alelia Walker's story if we go to Villa Lawaro, because Madam Walker moved into Villa Lawaro in 1918, May of 1918, died there in May of 1919. And Alelia Walker owned the house for the next decade until she died in 31. So she's really the one who had most of the parties and most of the events that were at the house. And the Madam Walker's story, Sarah Breedlove's story, and Alelia Walker's story is often a story about food. And that kind of gets lost when we're talking about the bigger issues of politics and business. But when Sarah Breedlove was in St. Louis, she worked as a washerwoman, but she also worked as a cook. When she moved from St. Louis to Denver, she was working as a cook for a pharmacist in Denver. And she was the pharmacist who helped her begin to mix up her own version of the formula. Then when she moved to Indianapolis and she had a house and she was manufacturing her products, she was still cooking for the tenants who lived in the house. So she was a good cook. Alelia Walker was an excellent cook. And when she would have parties, she always hired Black caterers, but she also was well known for her spaghetti recipe and for her eggnog. I have the recipes for those two things. And she loved champagne. She loved lobster. So I'm able to tell their story through food. And it was such a great opportunity to be able to talk about those parties when we did High on the Hog.
That sounds so amazing. I can only imagine, just how those parties were. And I wish I had a time machine to go back and just sit there and imagine, all just the moments of greatness and just, I have arrived, I am here, I can only imagine how she must have felt coming from Delta, Louisiana, and then eventually ending up and just being Madam C.J. Walker. I mean, how profound is that?
It is that, and she was in that, having been born in what essentially was a slave cabin, and then dying in this mansion on the Hudson River. That was quite a journey, and she really did represent that. She inspired other people. She gave, especially African American women, hope that they could improve their lives, that they could create generational wealth. And when she had a party, everybody wanted to be on that party list.
Now, I remember, talking to my mom before she passed, and she was talking about how her grandfather had warned Madam Walker, just about her health and, things to watch out for, and she needed to slow down. And I would love for you to talk about self-care as Black women, because when we give our all, we give our all. And sometimes, we, even back then, I mean, healthcare and doctors and things of that nature, that was still pretty new, and, going to doctors, which is probably why she had a private doctor. But I would love for you just to talk about self-care and some of the things that you might have noticed about researching Madam Walker, and how she took care of herself, or how she didn't take care of herself. So then that way we can have the wisdom now to make sure that we take care of ourselves as we launch empires.
You are so right. And she really had such a difficult early life with no real medical care. Diets were, we didn't know some of the things that we know now about hypertension and diets. And there really weren't the medications that we've come to take for granted. But she was suffering pretty early on from hypertension. And Dr. Ward was monitoring her health and prescribing what was available at the time. It advised that she go to Battle Creek, to the sanitarium, that she go to the Black Hospital in Hot Springs. And so she was getting the best care available. But at that point, the hypertension had advanced so much that her kidneys were really deteriorating. And one would have to say she exacerbated it because she was so driven that she wanted to be on the road. She had, one more sales agents to make, one more speech to make, one more product to introduce. And so she was really driving herself. I think it was a ministry, almost a mission, as she was trying to be the race woman that she was, to help other people. And it did mean that her health suffered. It did mean that she was not slowing down enough to take care of herself. And so she pushed herself too hard, even though, she did take some vacations and she did rest from time to time. But I just think that we would now say she would need to make sure that she gave herself more room to slow down, to take care of herself. Medical care was not what it is now, with all of the medications that we know and the things that we know about diet and hypertension. But, I think she was just too driven to slow down. But we need to pay attention to that and take care of ourselves, because we can't be here for the generations that we want to help if we are running ourselves into the ground.
So true. And Alelia Walker, I'm sure that was super painful for her to lose her mother. I would love for you to talk about just the process of how are you writing, what you can share, how you are telling her story, because you did such an incredible job with On Her Own Ground. I mean, it is one of the best pieces of literature, I think, that, a biography that really grabs you and engulfs you in her story. And you make each of the people that were pivotal in making her, Madam C.J. Walker, come alive. So I think I'm so excited for Alelia Walker's book to come out. And I'm just imagining what that's going to look like in the Harlem Renaissance, of you setting the tone and all the people that came around her. I mean, she was incredible. Could you talk about her and just what we can expect in your next book?
Sure. I'm very excited to be almost finished with this book. When I was writing On Her Own Ground, I thought initially that I was going to do a double biography, mother-daughter biography. And I realized about halfway through that I needed to write two different books. But I tried to establish the relationship between the two of them in On Her Own Ground. Now in Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, I'm really trying to talk about that relationship, but then let A'Lelia Walker take center stage because she is so overshadowed by her mother, and understandably so. You know, the first American woman entrepreneurial millionaire in America who employed thousands of women, who was involved in international conversations. You know, that's a pretty amazing, no story like that has ever been, told. But A'Lelia Walker had her own interest, and she had her own accomplishments. So Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker both loved music and theater. That was a bond between the women, so that when they had parties, it was all of the famous artists and writers and musicians who were coming. And A'Lelia Walker took that to the next level during the 1920s with parties and with her salon called the Dark Tower that she established to highlight some of the young writers like Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen. So I'm really trying to tell the story of the first Black heiress, her parties in New York, as well as her international travels. She went to London, Paris, Rome around the time of the coronation of the Pope, Cairo, Addis Ababa, where she met the Empress of Ethiopia. And just to tell this story, to create a sort of a different view of the Harlem Renaissance. We know about the writers because there have been many, many books written about them. But this is also about the writers, about the musicians, about the theater people, about the socializing that was going on. And I'm hoping to just create an atmosphere where people have a different lens on the Harlem Renaissance.
I am so excited for this book. I hope I get the first copy so I can read it.
Well, and Dr. Ward is actually in this book as well. Now, how is that? Because after Dr. Ward came back, Madam Walker had met one of his proteges, Dr. James Arthur Kennedy. And A'Lelia Walker had two boyfriends. So unlike Self-Made, which makes you think that she had a girlfriend named Esther, she did not have a girlfriend. The real conflict between mother and daughter was over these two doctors, Dr. Wiley Wilson and Dr. James Arthur Kennedy. Both were handsome, both were doctors. One went to Meharry, one went to Howard, and they were both suitors. One was a good guy, one was a bad boy. Wiley Wilson was the bad boy. Dr. James Arthur Kennedy was the good guy. He was the protege of Dr. Ward. Of course, Lelia was more in love with the bad boy. Her mother favored the good guy. And right before Madam Walker died, they had this discussion, and A'Lelia promised her mother that she was going to marry Dr. Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy came to Villa Lawaro, where Dr. Ward was at Madam Walker's bedside. And she said to Dr. Kennedy, "Promise me that you will make my daughter happy. I want you to get married, and then you both can go to Europe. You can study," because he was interested in studying shell shock and the psychological problems that the soldiers were having. So Madam Walker dies believing that Lelia is going to marry Kennedy. Lelia gets back to New York. Kennedy is long time separated but not divorced from his first wife. Wiley Wilson is in the wings, angling because she has a lot of money. She marries Dr. Wiley Wilson. As her mother predicts, it is a bad decision. Finally, they divorce, and she ends up marrying Dr. Kennedy. She marries him right at the time that he has been named number 2 to Dr. Ward at the Veterans Hospital. So I have scenes in Tuskegee in the new book.
Oh, you're gonna make me cry. You're gonna make me cry because when the U.S. Veterans Affairs, they didn't know that when they gave my great-grandfather, when they gave Joseph the award, they didn't know that he had any living relatives, and so I was so grateful, and my mom couldn't be there, when we received the award, and I was so grateful to the Secretary of Veteran Affairs, McDonald, for making sure that they printed a second award, which they never do, and because they gave the first award to Tuskegee, and it's at the Veterans Hospital at Tuskegee, and I was there, just there for the food pantry opening where they named the food pantry after him, and just imagining him on his horse, just, I don't, his story hasn't even been told yet. And, just imagining him on this horse and all the things, and my grandmother telling me these stories about how, when he was announced as this hospital administrator, the backlash and the KKK and just all of the things that he went through, and they moved his family from Indianapolis, and him losing his son to Spanish influenza, and so I'm so grateful that you are telling these stories, and I'm grateful to Dr. Leon Bates, my cousin, who has a blog about Dr. Ward, and just the connection, and just making it come to life. And I know in my heart and soul, even though you're telling these stories, that A'Lelia Walker was like a niece to him, because I can only imagine how, he watched her grow up.
Right.
He watched her grow up, and they were, if Madam C.J. Walker was living in his house early on, then she was there too,
Right.
And so and he wanted to make sure that she made a good decision, and his patients became his friends. And when I think about, just what it was like back then to be a Black doctor, a Black surgeon, and have Black folks in your care. And sometimes people didn't have money, and he would go with, a light into the backwoods to deliver babies. And then, they didn't have much money, and there would be, food on the porch, but then here's Madam C.J. Walker, his friend, he was there, and his wife's friend, Zella's friend. It wasn't that many people who had access back then like they did, and to think that they would also make sure that they gave back.
His story and Zella's story it's very important. I'm so glad that you are telling these stories now. You just think about it. The highest ranking Black medical officer in France during World War One, that, now we think, oh yes, there are lots of people in the military. That was a big deal. The Veterans Hospital, and for this book, I've done a lot of research on how that hospital came to be, the backlash, reading some of the old newspapers. I mean, the truly racist things that the elected officials and the community were saying about the hospital. There was a whole movement to make sure that there were no Black doctors or nurses in that hospital. Well, that was finally overcome, but they pushed against him. They tried to undermine him. So there is an amazing story to be told, and how he endured and how he built that hospital. There's one quote that I have. I can't remember who it's from, but maybe it was Robert Russa Moulton, who said, this is the biggest thing the federal government has ever done for the Black community, to create this state-of-the-art hospital. Because at that point, all of these Black soldiers had come back. They would if they went to a hospital in the North, they were put in a hallway. They weren't even accepted in the veterans hospitals in the South, but they were given terrible care. But they were suffering tuberculosis. They were suffering shell shock. They were suffering, all kinds of just other regular ailments. And to have a place where they could go that was designated, where the staff was Black, paying attention to their needs, was so important. There was also a lot of sort of groundbreaking bibliotherapy, using art and books to try to help people who were suffering from some of these mental traumas as a result of being at the war, with a woman who had been a librarian in Harlem who was recruited to come to Tuskegee, and then with Dr. James Arthur Kennedy, who was really interested in psychotherapy and was working with them. So there was a lot of very, very progressive activity going on at the hospital. And, that was led by Dr. Joseph Ward.
Thank you for saying that. I want to, just end this podcast, and I want to invite you back when the book comes out, because this is the beginning of many conversations.
I hope so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to just lift up. I want people to say out loud, if you're listening to this podcast, I want you to say Madam C.J. Walker's name. Say her name, Madam C.J. Walker. I want you to say A'Lelia Walker's name. I want you to say Dr. Joseph Henry Ward's name. Thank you. so much, Alelia, for being on this podcast and on this episode of Culture and Flavor. I'm emotional. I'm just thinking about all of my, the stories that were told to me. And it's so heartwarming to be able to talk with you and to hear your research and to know that we are deeply connected.
Well, and I do have to say a thank you to David Ferriero, the former archivist of the United States, who sent me a copy of your book when he saw that Madam Walker was mentioned. And that is one of the reasons that we're connected. Even though your mom and I met, and even though we knew about each other, I'm just so glad to actually have the chance to be in conversation with you and look forward to meeting you in person.
I'm so excited today. It's so special. Not only am I interviewing you, but we just got notice that Ed Mitchell's Barbecue is now the semifinals for the James Beard Food and Media Awards.
Ooh,
and
chills.
So, we are the Mitchells, myself, Baxter Miller, an incredible North Carolina photographer. Our team is so excited. And I was able to get that last recipe from my mother before she died of great-grandfather Joseph's oyster stew recipe.
Oh, love it.
And that's how we are connected because you read the book. And food has power. Black stories have power. Black stories must be told. What must be told. So I want to thank you all for this episode. I'm going to, wipe my tears and probably cry. We're just giving glory to God. So I want to thank you so much for being on this episode of Culture and Flavor. And thank you. And I can't wait for the book to come out, Alelia Walker, and for you to tell this story because the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, wow. Langston Hughes, all the folks that were in it, and my great-grandfather, Dr. Joseph Henry Ward. I want you, Black doctors, please research him. Please research him. All you have to do is just Google and find him. What he did for this country is remarkable. So thank you.
Thank you.
Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.
Craft cocktails, from the classics to zero-proof drinks, are all around us. But what if we told you that craft cocktails are actually a relatively recent addition to the culinary scene? My name is Toni Tipton-Martin, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Cook's Country at America's Test Kitchen. I want to introduce you to a podcast mini-series I'm hosting called 100 Proof, The Journey of the American Cocktail. Over 6 episodes, we'll look at how mixed drinks offer us a window into what was happening in America during the dawn of the cocktail. We'll then take you to the present day to contemplate what forces led to our modern cocktail renaissance. And along the way, we'll of course be sharing cocktail recipes with you. Subscribe to Proof from America's Test Kitchen so you won't miss the first episode. It drops on Thursday, May 23rd. Again, that's Proof, Proof, from America's Test Kitchen. Cheers.